right. My name is Justin, and I'm an addict. And thanks to my God, the steps, and the fellowship of other addicts, I'm sober one day at a time since June 19th, 2015. And for that, I am beyond grateful. Welcome to the RECO12 speaker meeting. We are an organization whose addictions include alcohol, drugs, lust and sex, food and gambling, just to name a few. We come together from all places, faiths, and backgrounds to learn the similarities of addiction and to gain tools and hope from others who are walking a similar path. We invite recovering addicts with at least 1 year sobriety and who are actively working their recovery in their respective fellowships to share their experience, strength, and hope on a live Zoom meeting each Friday at noon Central Time for 20 to 25 minutes. Then we, the live audience, get the opportunity to ask questions of the speaker for another 20 to 25 minutes. In order to ask questions, if you're here live, please type them in the Q&A link at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you are hearing this podcast recorded and would like to participate as a live audience member, or if you'd like to be a guest speaker in a future meeting, please go to www.reco12.com, that's RECO12.com, to learn more and submit your email address there to receive weekly invitations or to submit to become a guest speaker. RECO12 is an ad-free service, and we appreciate your help in keeping it that way. We gratefully accept contributions to help cover the cost of the Zoom platform, podcast platform, web hosting, and administrative costs. The guest speaker also chooses a fellowship or recovery-centered organization to which the majority of contributions from that week's meetings will be donated to. Angie has chosen to have any contributions from this week's meeting to go to Sexaholics Anonymous International. To contribute, you can go to reco12.com/support, where you can click the link to PayPal in the chat in the live meeting. Or if you use Venmo, you can also contribute there. Our handle is @RECO-12, and that's spelled out TWELVE. When you contribute, please specify the meeting number. This is meeting number 10. Last week's meeting with Andrew S. was a powerful and vulnerable account of his experience in addiction and recovery. If you missed hearing that one and wish to understand the phrase, "there is a couch in the hallway," you can listen to it or any other previous meetings in podcast form by searching for RECO12 Speaker Meeting Podcast on virtually any podcast platform that you use. Or you can go to the RECO12 website and find it under the link Podcast. Now let's introduce our guest speaker for today, Angie H. Angie is sober over 5 years, married for 32 years, has 4 adult children, and most of her family is in recovery. She will share today on forgiveness, even of those who really harmed us. And she has spoken in international speaker meetings and has been a guest on at least one podcast in the past, one that I know of, and there may be others. On top of that, she is one of my favorite people in recovery. Angie, the floor is now yours. And if I missed anything in that bio that you'd like to include, have at it.
Okay. Thanks, Justin, and thank you for inviting me and the kind words of me being one of your favorite recovery people. I feel the same. I chose this topic because it's very fresh to me. This just happened and taken place as far as the actual event that I'm going to be sharing with you today in April. So that's why I chose the topic of forgiveness. But let me qualify myself. Yes, my name is Angie. I am a grateful, recovering sexaholic and been sober since March 16, 2015, only by the grace of God and the love of this fellowship. So I'm very, very thankful to be here. And my hope today is just to bring a message that may help one person. So, as an addict, I didn't know that I was full of resentment and anger. I thought that I was a pretty happy-go-lucky person. And I didn't know how sick I had become with my own stinking thinking and the forces that drove me to justify being an addict. You know, my negative attitudes, my depression. I lived in a very dark place. No one would ever know that. On the outside, I tried to remain happy and bubbly and just really did a lot of suppressing. Very numb person. Didn't even know I was numb. So when I got into actually hit bottom, and it was a very deep bottom for me, one that brought me to my knees and knew that the jig was up, just like the White Book says. It's like, okay, something has got to be done because I can no longer live this way. And as I started working my recovery, I started learning about resentments. And what I know about resentments from the Big Book is that it's the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics and addicts than anyone, or than anything else. That and shame. Shame's a big motivator for just destruction of my own self as well. One of my favorite slogans about resentment, and maybe you've heard it before, is resentment is like drinking poison and wishing that the other person would die. And that was me. I held on to everything, and it was killing me from the inside out. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about what happened and where this resentment and anger came from, and how it manifested into multiple addictions throughout my life. So even before that, just to be thinking about, what does forgiveness look like for you? And just as I'm talking and sharing with you my experience, for me, forgiveness is about the release of letting resentment and anger go. And it was vitally important for me, for my mental health, my physical health, my emotional health, my spiritual health, to let it go, because I had been a person who had been victimized, and it was killing me. So when I was young, very young, I remember being groomed and lusted after around age 4. By the time I became age 10, there was some sexual abuse within the family. And at that point in time, I learned, because I was told, that I was loved and I was special. And that just kept me in a place of acceptance, I guess is what I want to say. As a young person, knew that something wasn't right, but yet, 40 years ago, it wasn't something that was talked about at all as far as any type of abuse. So I saw it as a loving gesture, even though in my gut, I knew something was wrong. So I got the courage to tell my mother, okay? Happened to be my mother's nephew, who at the time was 16 years older than me. So I remember being outside. We lived on a farm, running across the yard and jumping up to my mother, just like, hey, Mom, can you just stop for a minute? I need to tell you something. This is what's going on in my mind. And I remember just blurting it out to her. I don't remember my exact words, but I do remember her words, because her words helped to set my course. And her words were, oh, honey, that's ridiculous, in the story. And so what I later learned was that one person that I trusted in my life more than anyone could not be trusted. I learned that what I had to say wasn't important. I learned that her family and how she wanted to see her family and keep her family intact was more important than me. I learned a lot of deep-seated rebellion at that point. And so from there on, there's a passage in the White Book where it says, I set the course against my mother. And that's exactly what happened to me. I set my course. And so her reaction spurred my reaction, and I just started my path. I didn't have anybody that I could talk to, no one that I could trust, except for the abuser. And he became, as I was thinking about this today, he became somewhat of a higher power for me. And I'll talk more about that as I go along. So this is all really fresh on my mind because he just passed away April 7th, right during the heart of quarantine. And I didn't get the news directly. I got the news off of Facebook. And, I thought to myself many times, how would I feel when that day came? And at the moment, I just kind of thought about it, probably some shock. And then as the day wore on, I had all of these things that crossed my mind about my journey, how this affected my entire life, my family, my marriage, my family of origin. And so those are the things that I want to share with you today about my journey, about how I came to forgive. Now, keep in mind, this is 5 years down the road for me since discovery, since I was started recovery. Keep in mind that I had worked on a lot of trauma in therapy and in treatment. And keep in mind that I had done a lot of work around this. So this process that I'm talking about today is not just something that happened to me in an afternoon. It's been over the process of time. So what I learned, first of all, is that I was really thankful to be in program when I got this news. And I was really thankful for the steps, especially step 4, because that's where I knew my resentment was. And the funny thing is that I didn't even know I had anger or resented this person until I got into therapy. And my therapist told me, she's like, Angie, this was wrong. She said, had your mother taken action, more than likely he could have gone to jail because this was a felony. And it took me a long time to even accept that because, I never saw him as an abuser or a predator. I saw him as someone that I thought loved me. So it took me a long time just to realize that I did have anger towards the situation. And during my process of recovery, I think one of the biggest things that I was angry about was that I probably did blame him somewhat for setting my course to addiction. I didn't wake up one day and think, oh, great, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a sexaholic. I think that sounds like a great thing to do, or be an addict of any type. So I did have to work on that a little bit as I was thinking and going through my anger. But as I go through my thoughts today, I came to realize that what had happened actually turned into a blessing for me. So after realizing that I had anger and resentments, I started looking at where I took those anger and resentments and how I acted out those anger and resentments, not knowing that's what I was doing. So one of the behaviors is that I became a predator. I took from others to try and get my needs met because that's all I knew. I used manipulation and I was a pleaser to try and get my needs met because I didn't know how to ask for what I needed. I keep in mind, and I went back multiple times to the situation with my mother when I had a huge need for help and that wasn't available. She couldn't get me what she didn't have, and she did the best she could at that moment, which happened to be nothing. So I learned to survive on my own. And those were some of the behaviors that I had. I learned to be selfish and that to take for my own. I never believed that I was a selfish person, but now that in recovery, I look back and it was all about me and what I needed to survive. And Thankfully, recovery has given me so much more and has taught me how to ask for my needs so I don't have to just survive anymore, that I can have a happy, joyous, and free life. I learned to be dishonest, and I learned to hold secrets. Secrets that I had for my entire life since that day with my mother, that I would never, ever think that I would reveal to anyone. I thought I would take them to my grave. I didn't know that they were killing me slowly every day. I didn't learn what love looked like. I learned what lust looked like. And I will tell you, that's been probably the hardest thing for me as far as intimacy goes within my marriage and with my relationship. I feel that I was robbed from the natural progression of dating and what it was like to just maybe go out to dinner or go to a movie, because none of that ever happened. It was always very foreign to me until I met my husband, and that's how we dated at the beginning, which was really strange and weird to me. But I started learning a little bit at that time, but I was still a very lustful person, desiring to lust, and most importantly, to be lusted after, because that's what I learned. With that, I became a love cripple, not even knowing what love looked like in a relationship. I knew fantasy, and I knew what my mind created, that what I thought love looked like. But again, it was just another form of lust. I learned to be emotionally numb. I couldn't even name my emotions when I first got into recovery. And I was just numb, very, very numb. I kept my disease and my addiction and my dopamine and all of my chemicals at such a high level that until I got sober, I didn't know how drunk I really was. I was like a zombie, just walking around, going through the motions. I learned that my will was the way I was living. I had heard about God's will. I am a person of faith, and I had attended church all those years, and I did say a prayer about God's will, but it was just words. It didn't mean anything to me. And I learned to ignore the commandment about adultery, because he was married and eventually I was married. Those are behaviors that I learned that became okay, and that was easy to justify and rationalize because of my addiction. I also used to learn, I used other substances to numb and to escape and to self-medicate. So I'd like to move into some of the things I've gained in my step work and my recovery. So focusing on, how this experience, this life journey, my course has helped me get to where I'm at today. So here's a question. Through it all, this was my path to freedom. And how is that even possible? To have been in self-denial and self-bondage for years, living within myself. How could all of this come to a positive place where it would set me free? Well, one of the things that this program's taught me is to be rigorously honest. And it was very hard to be rigorously honest in the beginning, not only with another person, but with myself, because my addict was still with me, and my addict would always taint and turn and maneuver things in favor of how the addict wanted to think and see and feel. So learning to be rigorously honest has been a great challenge, but it's also one of my most favorite things about recovery. I have no secrets. I'm wide open. I have nothing to hide to anyone. And that's a feeling that I never thought I would have. I learned to see and forgive my own faults and my own character defects. As I go through this process, I've been able to look at myself and get myself out of a victim stance. There's a saying that I've heard that says, I remain the victim in recovery until I go through my fifth step. which I get to fully start looking at myself and see my part in my resentments and my anger. I get to start looking at my own character defects. One of my most favorite things about this is I get to share my experience and hopefully help others. I've also learned that pain and suffering has led me to a God of my understanding who is all loving and all merciful. And my higher power loves me for my weakness, that there is nothing that I have done that he will not forgive me for, and that he is so merciful that that is what he wants me to do for myself as well, is to let go of the pain, the suffering, the shame, to be able to be free of this and to be useful to another person. I've learned how to not live in the victim mode or self-pity. I was very much in that mode. I took all criticism. I took all blame. I kept myself in a one-down position. Now I know that that's not true. That was my own negative self-talk. So I am mostly free of that. Once in a while I get stuck in my head, but for the most part, that's not even a place that I live anymore. I've learned how to clean up the wreckage of my past. And most importantly, live my amends daily. That's another part of this program, is having the opportunity to make my wrongs right and to be the wife that I wasn't before, to be a mother that I wasn't before, to just be an authentic, loving, kind person that I wasn't before. I thought it was, but it was all a lie, because I couldn't be authentic because I was full of shame and secrets. One of the hardest parts of my recovery was to see my part in the 4-step. And what that looks like to me is, what can I own from this experience? And this is where this whole thing starts looking and turning to forgiveness. First of all, a dear friend of mine that's in recovery with me, she kind of led me this way, and she said, "What about judging, Angie? That's not our job to judge another person." And I'm like, that's really hard to accept and look at, because I was the victim. Even though I was a victim at one time, I also became a predator. So I made choices along the way to not only harm myself, but to harm other people. And in the big book, it talks about, actually, if you have the chance and you have it, if you go through step 4 on pages starting on 64 through 67, there's some really great, helpful words there on letting go of resentment and working. But one of the most favorite things is talking about, we ask God to help show us the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, "This is a sick man. How can I be helpful?" God, save me from being angry, and thy will be done. So that's all about forgiveness to me. That is how I chose, with God's help, the love of the program, the support of other people, to be able to turn this whole path of my life around to forgiveness by seeing this person and my mother as sick people. So it's not my job to judge another person. I don't know their past. I don't know their hurts or their sufferings. I don't know why they do the things they do. All I can do is take care of myself, be responsible for myself. I also had choices about my behavior. through all that time period, I knew what was right and wrong, but my addict was my God and my higher power, and that's who I listened to. My addict always justified, always rationalized, always had the best answer. I harmed others. I was very prideful too. Being prideful meaning that, what I thought I was doing was okay, and that I didn't need to listen to anybody else because I thought I was doing what I needed to do, again, to survive. I continued to harm myself through negative thinking, and most importantly, I had a terrible spiritual malady. The absence of God in my life was very real. And with that, I chose my will over God's will for me. And as I stated, my addictions were my higher power. That's where I went for comfort. So a little bit about this day that I found out that he passed away, some of the things that I experienced on that day, and the forgiveness that came. One of the first things I did was I prayed for him. I prayed for his family. And I prayed for his soul. I don't know that he ever found recovery, but I do know that my family, I'm fourth generation sexaholic. There's a lot of alcoholism in my family. There's a lot of codependency. There's a lot of addiction and suffering that I came from. So I know that there's a lot of pain there. And so the first thing I wanted to do was to pray for him and his family. That particular day, we were home because of the quarantine. And my loving husband and I were sitting outside, and all of a sudden, just such sorrow and grief just came. It was like a 2-hour crying and cleaning house. And my husband sat there and listened to me, God bless him. And what was happening was like I was being cleansed from all of this suffering and pain that I had gone through in my recovery. Up until that point, it had been like work that I had done, but I don't know that I had fully felt my body release the tensions and the fear and the sadness that I had experienced through my life from holding on to all of those secrets and lies and resentments. And it actually felt like I was in a movie. And I remember just sitting there with my eyes closed and just kind of holding myself, my mind, my head. And it was just like a movie of flashbacks was going through like a reel. Things that I hadn't thought about for years, things that hadn't even come up in my trauma work, my recovery, sharing with others. And so what was happening was this cleansing. And after it was all said and done, I was exhausted. It was almost probably like an exorcism where demons were leaving my body. But it was the most amazing gift that I could ever experience as far as forgiveness goes, because I knew it was real. It's easy to say, I forgive you, or I'm sorry, or I need to make amends. It's easy to say those, but my experience of really going through the pain, I knew it was real. And I knew that he was a sick person, and that I was able to accept that. So what I would like to share next is, and something to think about. If you are in recovery, if you are new to recovery, if you don't know anything about recovery, I encourage you to think about this question. This is the question that I came up with during this day, and it's like, could a human ever have a greater gift than recovery and sobriety? The gift of forgiveness, the willingness to do that. And from my experience, it's worth every ounce of willingness to go to any lengths. And that's one of the things that we ask newcomers when they come into the room. Are you willing to go to any length? Are you willing? Is this what you really want? And I will tell you that it's been my greatest gift. And so finally, I'd like to end with this. When I was sharing with the gentleman in Colorado that said, you know, I guess I was sharing with Justin before the meeting. My husband and I were giving a speaker talk in Colorado last year, and a friend of ours who'd been in the program for like 20 years came up to us afterwards and he says, you guys are on the cusp of the next level with talking about your recovery, a spiritual level. And we both just looked at each other and looked at him as like, I really don't know what you're talking about. Can you give us an example? And so what I make up about it now is this whole thing of forgiveness, being able to share about my part in it and my spiritual malady. But through this whole thing, and it even came out when I was outside sobbing hysterically with my husband, that what if, and this is what I choose to believe, that the abuse and my addiction that separated me from God set me on a path of my own will, led me into darkness, but through recovery, I've accepted my cross, my addiction, my abuse, my dysfunctional family. And I believe that this was my path to happy, joyous, and free. And I'm going to close with this. Trust God, clean house, help others. Thanks, Justin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angie. That was beautiful. I appreciate your vulnerability, your willingness to share these things. I mean, there's some powerful and some painful things in there. Now, before we get to reading any questions that have come in, and remember, if you have questions for Angie, please type them in the Q&A link that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window. But before we do that, I'd like to give Angie about, just a minute to share something, why you chose SA as the organization that you want contributions from this meeting to go to.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Well, first of all, SA is my home. SA is my family. SA is the first place that I've ever felt that I could be my authentic self. It's the path that's led me to know that my course is to help others. That's what my creator put me here for. So SA is very dear to my heart. I did start an other S program, but quickly found that this is where I needed to be. And I know it helps a lot of people. It's in my opinion, sexaholism is a very deep underlining addiction. And I'm thankful for the work that SA can do to help others with it. So that's why.
Awesome. Thank you, Angie. All right. It's time for Angie to answer any questions that have come in. I have several here, and we'll get to as many as we can address in the next 20 minutes. So let's see. Angie, one of the things you mentioned was that you no longer regularly live in your own head. You mentioned that during this. How the heck do you get out of your own head? How do you live outside of your own head?
Oh my gosh. Well, I will say it's taken a lot of work and a lot of practice. I guess what I mean by that is I'm emotionally sober. So once I got sober from lust and other abusive substances, I was forced to feel and learn what all these feelings were. And then it's like, oh my gosh, what do I do with all these? And my work of going to the core of where all of my negative thoughts and self-talk came from, by learning that and being able to attach a negative emotion to the core of where it came from, helps me to stay in the moment and stay emotionally sober. So staying out of my own head now looks like I have boundaries. So if someone says something, I know immediately, okay, well, that's not my stuff. So I'm not even taking it in, and I stay in my happy, joyous, and free place. So it's a lot of awareness, a check-in, really. It's a check-in of what am I thinking about, what's going on. But most importantly, if I'm not in conscious contact with God, then I'm pretty much in my head. And my head is not a safe place to be. So I try and get back to just staying in a healthy place with the God of my understanding.
Awesome. And I love the reference there to emotional sobriety. We're going to have a speaker in 2 weeks that will be his topic, is emotional sobriety. So for those of you listening now that are like, what the heck is emotional sobriety and how the heck will I ever get there? Come back in 2 weeks and you'll hear a great presentation on that. All right. I got another question for you here. You mentioned that you have nothing to hide from anyone now. You're an open book. If somebody asks you, you're willing to share. And with that, nothing to hide from anyone, how have you noticed the relationships you have with others around you change in that? Do people look at you like you have two heads growing off your shoulders when you share things that seem a little bit weird, or do they embrace you? And does your relationship come closer?
Well, so with that, I have to be in a safe place to be able to be my open, vulnerable self. And unfortunately, the world out there is not a safe place. So when I'm referring to that, I'm referring to my own husband and my 4 sons and my recovery family. In fact, we were at a face-to-face meeting last night. We were talking about SA, especially for women, and how it can be a very a negative thing. I mean, in my mind, if I would have heard something about being a sexaholic years ago, my mind would have been to the criminal level. It would have just been, I had no clue about the different, how it's such an umbrella and there's so many areas of it. So from that, I'm very careful on who I share things with. But honestly, I don't have a lot of outside people that I talk to anymore. It's usually all in recovery or on meetings. Everyone else, I still just surface. I can tell whether a person's being authentic with me or not. And honestly, I have shared my disease with others if the conversation went that way and I felt safe. Just to a couple people.
Yeah, and in those situations, did you feel like they embraced you, or did they like turn away and shun you?
One was a family member, and she was very much embracing, and she said that she was really thankful that I had this conversation because her father and sister both died in the disease of sexaholism and alcoholism and other substance abuse. So it like filled a blank for her, like it did with me. The other person that I shared it with, I don't think he heard me. I don't think he had the knowledge to accept what I was trying to tell him. So I just kind of went, okay, I went on.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks. Got a question that came in from Braden. He says, hey, Angie, on the topic of being an open book, what is the line between being honest and open and discretion and privacy? And I think you touched on it there, but go ahead and expound on that a little bit more, please.
Well, I will share my own experience. So after discovery, my husband, neither one of us obviously was in recovery, and he was very controlling, and he wanted to know every detail about everything. And I felt at that time I didn't have a choice because at that I was at the cusp of losing my family, my home, my life, everything. I mean, there wasn't much left. And so what I learned about that and what he learned about it later was to be careful. And it does talk about it in our white book about a caution that when we are ready to share or disclose information to, I think details are not important because in his case, he couldn't get the details out of his head. And it was probably about a 2-year healing process for him to work through everything that I shared with him. So I would definitely keep things not descriptive and not very many details because it will cause harm. Even if that person is demanding, as he was, it's what I know now is that I would say, hey, I really need to check in with my sponsor, or I need to talk to my therapist or someone in program before I share more information. So I would get the experience of someone else before I went down that road again. I wouldn't have known that then.
I think that's very wise. I see a lot of damage done to relationships with premature full disclosure of details, and it's hard to overcome that. And I appreciate that feedback from you. All right, Angie, you got another question here from Sarah. She says, "Hello, sister. I attended late. Can I ask how to forgive the addicts who live with me at the same place and are not seeking recovery? They are from my family."
That's a really good question. What I'm thinking is, of course, keeping good boundaries, learning what's my stuff, what's their stuff. But ultimately, when I put people into that area, like it talks about in the big book, of a sick person, it's no different than someone with cancer or diabetes or whatever their illness is. And to not take it personal, it has nothing to do with me. Like I said earlier, I don't know someone else's path, and I don't know why they're hurting so much. And that's the one thing that I truly believe this. I believe that every addict out there is suffering from some sort of pain that's happened to them, whether it's real or imagined, and that they are escaping. I know that there's a few situations, and I don't know statistics on, and I listened to something the other day with when a person chooses a substance or lust or whatever it is for the first time, it chemically alters their brain. So that's part of this whole thing. So I guess my experience would be to pray for that person, have love and tolerance for that person, and just continue to, keep myself safe. If that person is toxic, I don't have to have a relationship with that person. I can have that relationship from a distance. And the other thing, too, I'm thinking about is to not have any expectation. I can't expect someone who is sick to give me what I need because they don't have it to give.
Thank you, Angie. That's very helpful, and I think that the situation brought up there is really hard. But I think the principles that we've discussed here about forgiveness, praying for them, boundaries, I think those are really helpful for that. I have another question from what you shared in there in your talk. You mentioned how you had been a church-going person during pretty much all your life, from what I recall there. And you said the prayers and you did the actions, but they were just prayers and actions. When did you realize that changed? How did that change happen when it went from just words and actions to words and actions that actually meant something?
That's a great question. I love talking about that. In the big book, it talks about spiritual awakening and spiritual experience. And I've shared on this before, I think I would have expected it to be, my growth with spirituality, just like a lightning bolt. But boom, everything is just clear and I see things differently. But what I've learned is that it's been a day-to-day growth, and it happens so gradually that I didn't even know the transformation was happening. And it happened for me because I had a lot of willingness to get better. I had willingness to work on my recovery every day, whether it was making a meeting or talking to someone. I mean, I was on death row when I got into this. I mean, things were about as bleak as they could get. And so going from that point and working each day is where I got to a place with conscious contact. Now, keep in mind, there was a lot of work and study and reading and talking and learning and listening to get there. And I can't tell you one particular thing that got me there, but I know in step 11, it starts talking about meditation, and it talks about being quiet and listening. Because when I was in my head, there was no quiet. There is no way I could have ever heard God's grace speak to me. Impossible. So as I learned to be quiet, then I started learning to listen. And that's really how it started happening. And also, I would share things with my therapist, and she'd say, well, Angie, that's God's grace. And I would just look at her like, I have no idea what you just said. It was like a foreign language. So I started learning from her as well. And just really believing that, this was my path, and God has bigger things for me, and the awareness of trying to help others is really where I gained a lot of my spirituality.
Thank you. All right, we've got 2 more questions that have come in. We'll answer them real quick and get on with this after that. First one comes from Esther. She says, "Hi, Angie. Thank you so much for your share. I have done a resentment inventory on a person in recovery who has really pained me many times, and I can't seem to let go of resentment and forgive this person. At the same time, I miss this person so much and want her in my life. How do you forgive in that situation?"
Surrender. Complete surrender. That's where humility comes in. If I hang on to any ounce of pride, it will keep me in a place of resentment. I must be willing to, as the big book says, how important is it really? Is it really that important? And when I can truly believe that and accept that, then I can move forward. It doesn't mean that I'm going to let that person harm me again. It means that I need to keep safe boundaries and maybe not be as vulnerable with that person. I don't know the situation. But ultimately, too, to keep in mind that that's a sick person, and that I accept that that's a sick person, and therefore I have no expectation about how this relationship's going to go. I think that that's one of the hardest things it's been for me, is to accept what a relationship really looks like. Meaning, I may have this fanciful thing of how I think this relationship is or what it looks like, but it's not that way in reality at all. So therefore, I grieve and accept, and then I can move forward, but only with protecting myself.
Very wise. I like that. Thank you. And our last question here is from an anonymous attendee. The anonymous attendee says, "Angie, thank you very much for your sincerity and vulnerability. I am deeply moved by your journey, where you have been and where you are today. Thank you for your courage and willingness to lift others. How would you counsel someone who knows they need to forgive someone for a significant harm, but they just can't find it in their heart to forgive?"
Well, the first thing that's coming to my mind is, I was a sick person. I was a really sick person. And when I started looking at myself and owning my own stuff that really helped me to, my heart became less hardened. And also, I talked about this, I'm not the judge of this person or what I think. I know that there's some deep hurts out there, betrayal being one of them. I've been on both sides of betrayal. But honestly, humility, I can't put myself above another person. And if I do, then I'm just going to stay in pain and misery. And like I said, resentment's like poison. And if I keep drinking it, it's just going to kill me. And the other person has no freaking clue that they've harmed me. And that sobered me up real quick when I knew that I was seething and the other person didn't even know. And I did all that harm to myself for no reason. So that's kind of just my thoughts right there.
Awesome. Thank you, Angie. Before we close up, do you have any other parting thoughts, words of wisdom that you want to share with us or anybody else that may be listening in the future?
I'm just very grateful every day for the opportunity to live in recovery. And I think I'll share that. I was at a conference once, and the gentleman shared about, yes, we learn the steps, we work the steps, but ultimately it's about living the steps. And that is definitely where I'm at today. I don't have to think, oh, I need to do some step 4 on this. My mind is in the process of rewiring from where it used to be to where it is today. And so living the steps is just the greatest gift that I could ever offer to anyone. I don't care if you're an addict or not, it's just the right way to live. It's total freedom.
Love it. Thank you very much, Angie. That was a great RECO12 weekly speaker meeting for all addicts and those wanting to learn more about addiction and the recovery therefrom. If we didn't get to your question, or if you have other questions, please go to RECO12.com/forum and join in our community to ask those questions and answer others' questions that will come up. And also, I didn't ask Angie this, but I think she'll be good. If somebody has a question for her and wants to relay it through me, I can get it to her, and I'm sure she'd be happy to answer that question. You can get that to me by emailing RECO12pod, RECO12pod @gmail.com, and I can get that forwarded to her. I invite the audience to come back next week. We have a fantastic speaker next week from England. Her name is Pamela B., and she is an eating addict, a food and overeating addict, and it will be a fantastic one. I'm really excited for that. If you have not yet gone to RECO12.com and submitted your email address, you only need to do this once. Please get on the invitation list so you can join us live each Friday at noon Central Time. If you're listening here and want to join into future ones, get there. Go to RECO12.com and submit your email address. We'll get you an invite. Now, at this time, as we close out, Angie has chosen the prayer of St. Francis to do, and she would like to say it herself. So, Angie, hit it. The rest of you can join in if you please.
Thanks, Justin. A moment of silence for all those sick and suffering in and outside these rooms. Lord, make me a channel of thy peace, that where there's hatred, I may bring love, that where there is wrong, I may bring a spirit of forgiveness, that where there is discord, I may bring harmony, and where there is error, I may bring truth, that where there is doubt, I may bring faith, that where there is despair, I may bring hope, that where there are shadows, I may bring light, and where there is sadness, I may bring joy. Lord, grant that I may seek rather to comfort than be comforted, to understand than be to understood, to love than to be loved, for it is by self-forgetting that one finds. It is by forgiving that one is forgiven. It is by dying that one awakens to eternal life. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. Keep coming back. It works if you work it. So work it. You are worth it. Thank you so much, Angie. It was a good time.
Standing still a moment, carving out this time, reflecting on the landscape of this life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight. Still searching for glimmers of light. Feet still on the ground, I can still be found, standing still.
My wings are torn and tattered, but I know I still can fly. I may not soar unfettered, I may not rise too high.
Recorded in the book of life and bind it with a seal that I am bowed and broken, I am standing still.
Only God knows where the path of life will yet lead me. I do not even ask to know, I do not need to see.
It is enough to know that I'm loved and not alone. And with those truths, I thankfully march into the unknown. Still standing, I will fight the good fight. Still searching for glimmers of light. Feet still on the ground, I can still be found. Still standing, I will fight the good fight. Still searching